Okay, excellent.
Oh,
It's something that just appeared to me.
okay. Hi, everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes as members of the audience come in, although I understand that the door was open already by mistake. But we'll wait a couple of minutes as usual, just for anyone who's having any trouble clicking the right buttons and getting the tech to work on demand and so on. And then we'll make a start. Maybe I should learn how to hum a good tune so I can entertain people as as we wait for the first couple of minutes, but maybe not, maybe not. All right, okay, I think 1601, nearly 1602, we can make a start. Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this, the fifth of six webinars in this particular series. And in a moment, as usual, Juvaria will do the introductions and so on to the theme for today, the transnational right in world politics, and also our speakers, an excellent range of speakers, actually, really interesting. Looking forward to the insights on this big question as well. I just want to say a few words about the global webinar series, why we have it, what it's for, what we're trying to do. And it's basically fairly simple in that it was inspired in part by the decolonizing, the curriculum decolonizing knowledge, global knowledge idea. The idea that there are some big world questions, but there are also multiple perspectives from which people can attempt to address those world questions. And the perspectives with which we address those questions can also vary according to who you are, where you live, where you work, the environment within which you're socialized, the kind of methodologies or theoretical perspectives that you choose to use, and the particular periods of history that you may study. And there are a whole variety of ways in which we can see some really big questions. So the idea was to use the platform that Zoom offers us, a kind of bringing into our living rooms people from all around, and having a really interesting conversation with people who are serious thinkers and researchers, and people who've given a lot of time and attention to some of these kinds of questions. So that basically it is. And second thing was really to try to make available resources to scholars, teachers, and students because of the kind of range of knowledge which we're bringing to bear on these questions, so that they can use them in their studies, sort of add those to their kind of reading lists or the viewing. We record the webinars and distribute them as widely as possible. And we also wanted to build some sort of partnerships, and we have with several institutions and groups, one in Brazil, in Cuba, in India, in other groups in London, and elsewhere as well, in Germany. So we have got quite a range of people, but we're trying to add a couple more in South Asia. We already have support of The Wire in New Delhi, a investigative news website, but we're working with a colleague at JNU in Delhi, and also another colleague in Pakistan at NAST. And we're hoping to sort of extend our networks in that kind of way. And through that, we kind of get people who are doing scholarship and serious thinking about questions that we don't know about, who are not in our kind of very hardwired global North networks. And one of the key challenges has been for Juvaria and me and others who we've asked for help is, how do we actually break into networks of scholars and thinkers and so on outside of the ones we've established over so many years? And we have kind of working our way slowly towards that, but it is quite a challenge. But it is an interesting challenge because we're also discovering and finding out about all kinds of interesting people that we never knew about as well. So that's a really interesting thing about it. And it's an organic process. It kind of changes as it goes. We can dip into major themes as we please and get interesting people into the conversation. So that's what we're broadly trying to do. So I'll stop there and ask Juvaria to make an introduction to the theme and to the speakers today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Inderjeet. Today's session is on the transactional right in world politics. So we've assembled a panel of 4 scholars who are working on various aspects of this theme. I'll introduce them now along with their topics, because it's quite interesting to see the sort of various aspects of what we're doing today. So we have with us Dr. Nicholas Michelsen. He's from King's College London. His topic is the Reactionary Internationale. Dr. Nicholas Michelsen is a reader in the Department of War Studies at King's College. His research focuses on the contemporary new right in international relations, strategic communications in world politics, and the history of international thought. He is Director of Research in the King Center for Strategic Communications, and from January, he'll be the Director of Education in the Department of War Studies. We're also very pleased to have with us today Dr. Nitasha Kaul of the University of Westminster, who is going to be speaking about Hindutva as a global force. Dr. Kaul is an academic and a novelist who publishes short fiction, non-fiction essays, and poetry, and also speaks to various gatherings of creatives, writers, poets, and academic scholars. She has authored numerous articles in edited books, journals, newspapers, all on the themes of identity, economy, gender, social theory, feminist, post-structuralist, post-colonial critiques, technology, democracy, Kashmir, and Bhutan. At present, she is an associate professor in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster in London, and her previous affiliations have been with institutions in Hull, the UK, and Delhi in India. We also have with us today Dr. Mustafa Kutlay from the City University of London, and his topic is the global political economy of right-wing populism, key puzzles and paradoxes. Dr. Kutlay is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at City University of London. His research focuses on comparative politics, political economy, shifts in international order, Turkish politics, and the politics of development in the global south. His published work includes articles in international affairs, government and opposition, and Third World Quarterly, and also policy reports and briefs for policy-making institutions. We also have with us Dr. Xin Fan, who is from the State University of New York in Fredonia, and he will speak about the right to talk about China, Chinese intellectuals, and the rise of emotional politics. Dr. Xin Fan is an associate professor of history at the State University of New York. He is an intellectual historian with a strong research interest in global history. He's the author of World History and National Identity in China in the 20th Century. That's from Cambridge University Press, published this year. And he's also the second editor of a volume, Receptions of Greek and Roman Antiquity in East Asia, published by Brill in 2018. He's a fellow at the Joint Center on World Making from a Global Perspective in Germany, as well as a visiting scholar at the George Washington University in Washington, DC. Thank you all for joining us today.
Great, thank you, Juvaria. So we'll go in the order that we're on the poster. So Nicholas, you have 15 minutes to make your presentation. And members of the audience can put into the Q&A a question at any time for any of our speakers, and I'll curate them as we go along. Thank you very much, Nicholas.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm really delighted to come and talk. I mean, the thematic of global knowledges in particular really excited me, partly because this idea of what it would mean to have a global knowledge of the international, transnational right is pretty much exactly what I've been thinking about recently. And if I have time in the 15 minutes, I'll try and say something about, sort of say, the decoloniality of the international right, if I can, but we'll see if I get there. So what I'm going to do quickly is outline briefly, at least the broad strokes of the argument I'm developing with colleagues, not on my own, so with Pablo de Orellana and Filippo Costa Buranelli. And the broad stroke of our argument is that we think the new right, or the new right has an internationalism, right? It sings a song, an internationale, as it were, of the right. But that internationale is sung by a very weird grouping. The new right refers, as we use it, to a variety of intellectual movements that emerged since the 1980s worldwide, many centered in the West, but not all. So this includes very odd mixtures, so Reaganite economic conservatives, but also cultural critics, people like Alexandre Dugan, Alain de Benoist, but also various populists or authoritarian political movements that have swept to power across the globe. So we see an international reactionary compact emerging between new right populists in democratic states like the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Holland, Hungary, and populist leaders and authoritarians across the global south, so Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia. all of which advocate in a fairly collective manner for international normative change, which we see as expressed in a commonly articulated desire to dismantle liberal international norms, particularly rights and rule-based multilateralism, and replace them with a very distinct vision of sovereignty. They prioritize, in the way in which they articulate together, transactional deal-making, permitting and legitimizing spheres of exclusive competence. So we see this as effectively a transnational philosophy, rooted in disdain for democratic pluralism, equality of people, issues around immigration, participatory politics, women's rights are regular thematics. And the links between these actors we see as circulating around a set of common practices seeking to correct what they see as the impacts of globalist institutions that emerged following the end of the Cold War. So we see this as an international thing in its fundamental nature. But of course, there's huge disagreements within the academic communities about what's at stake in the transnational or international relationships between these diverse movements. The key question here relates to whether we're talking about a return to a more realist world orientated around states, or something organized around something very different terms of reference, for example, using civilizational, religious, or other forms of transnational terms of reference or identity to organize world politics in some way. Now, our argument is that these movements, whilst diverse, and both in the types of actors they are and the types of places where they operate, with regards to their international, have some important cohesive factors, but also even where they disagree, they do so in a way that often facilitates cooperation around human rights, establishing spheres of competence, and so on. So we think the transnationalism of the new right raises really important questions for international relations, because they have the potential as a loose network or grouping to reorganize the rules of the game of international society and reform some very concrete institutions at work. The most important of these is the one I'm going to focus on today, which is that we see a very specific articulation of sovereignty playing out across these movements and groups, which is a kind of birth cultural, as we put it, conception of the nation state. Now, what's important about this conception of sovereignty in the nation state, as I understand it anyway, is that it's actually quite an intuitive idea of what a nation state is for, but it also cuts across to the left, where you also see discourses that talk in very similar terms about the relationship between birth, culture, sovereignty, and the purpose of the nation state. So there's an important way in which this is useful, because it steals territory from their critics. And I'll come back to this when we turn to the decoloniality of the new right, if I have time at the end. Look, we all know sovereignty is not a singular concept. It has a complex, ambulant history, right? So distinctive conceptions of sovereignty have existed in varieties of places and emerge throughout, the international history, right? So when I'm talking about a particular or peculiar articulation of the nation state or sovereignty, I mean it's very distinctive, right? It's not the same as other articulations of sovereignty, right? And I think that this particular way of talking about the nation state is central to the global culture wars that underpins the transnationalism of the new right. But look, to try and articulate this, let me kind of address the Nazi in the room, as it were, proverbially speaking, which is to say that commonly when we talk about the internationalism of the new right, we talk about it as if this was a kind of racist outgrowth of fascism in history, re-emerging in the international domain, often in the form of white nationalism. Now, it's really important, I think, to recognize that these movements do not follow a strictly fascist way of thinking about identity, right? The key thing about fascism is it's about remaking nature, developing it and bending it to the will of man, right? So uomo fascista, the fascist man, is born out of the mind of the pioneering nationalist, but it has to be invented and molded and made, right? So it's a kind of vision of society that's to do with purifying identity, which involves nurturing what they talked about in people like Mussolini, Primo de Rivera, nurturing spirito as the optimal realization of the biological identity of the race. So fascism features this revolutionary program for social change, right, that transforms society often from top to bottom. So race is the ground, but fascist man has to be made. Now, most of the 1930s European reactionary philosophy had this particular link between raza and spirito, right? This is the way in which it works in the Italian framing. And the programmatic move is to heroically enact a new national identity, right, based on the ground of the race. Now, the new right internationally retains this kind of axiomatic logic, but it abandons the program as it plays out. Instead of trying to program a future and transform it, most new right nationalist discourses are largely content to purify and unshackle national identity. It's a very passive approach to thinking about national identity. And this is tied to the international turn to culture, right? So it's all about a sort of, so race appears here, it doesn't disappear, But the birth cultural axiom as a way of thinking about sovereignty diverges in really important ways from the Rasa Spirito one, because it integrates race into a much broader conceptualization of identity, which is mediated by the constructive role of culture in history. So identity remains circumscribed by birth, which explains why the New Right and most of its politicians internationally attack jus solis, the idea of citizenship for children of foreigners born in national territory, whether in India or in Italy. But it is culture that emerges as the immutable and primordial element of the national culture, removing need for active self-improvement, rather leaving only a passive protection of cultural purity. So birth is kind of like the limit condition of culture, binding past and future belonging into existing membership. But it's much more slippery than previous articulations of sovereignty in relationship to identity. Race, of course, remains part of birth culture, but it's subsumed as an accident of birth. So it never needs to be explicitly articulated. This is why the New Right very rarely talks about race, if ever talks about race. It's the link between birth and culture that's important. And the reason it's important is also because it's very difficult to critique. Because of course, many people on the left have a birth cultural conception of identity too. They talk about cultural heritage as a code for articulating identity all the time, right? So birth culture is the core, certainly, of the European New Right's electoral and discursive machinery. It's particularly evident in all their foundational texts. So if you look at something like de Benoist and Champatier's Manifesto for the New Right in the year 2000, they're very explicit. They cite, this is cited very widely. Right? They conceptually refute the existence of humanity as a social and political category. So their point is, to quote them, mankind as such does not exist, for its affiliation to humanity is always mediated by cultural belonging. So it's a really important quote because it really clearly articulates the conception of political sovereignty that they're developing. These ideas drew very explicitly on French anti-liberal late 19th century nationalists like Maurras and Barrès. And the whole idea here is to locate national belonging in relationship to a conceptualization of culture that is determinate, immutable, and eternal. Right? The international New Right, as I see it, coalesces around this concept of the nation as a vestibule of birth culture, which produces a particular way of thinking about how sovereignty plays out in world politics, right? So all transactions in world politics are between birth cultures, predicated on spheres of influence, which are defined by appeal to those birth cultures. So you could look at this in Ukraine, in Taiwan, in Kashmir. Very similar discourses play out, right? The transnational is very clear in the European New Right, because when they talk about their relationships with the rest of the world, the European New Right proposes that its birth cultural conception of the nation is good because it's anti-liberal. Right? Liberalism is criticized for destroying the autonomy of cultures. The history of the West, as they articulate it, is a history of ongoing cultural as well as political colonialism. So people like de Benoist, they argue for their transnational right project on the grounds that the project of decolonization is incomplete, and it continues through international aid and UN-led liberal paternalism. So the answer the New Right develops, the answer that allows them to build international linkages, is that they want to restore an independent status to diverse birth cultures and indigenous worldviews in international relations, and to suggest that people belonging to birth cultures must actively work towards their national cognitive emancipation from the baggage of liberal modernity, only if necessarily violently, right? They're not necessarily committed to a violent emancipation. The global New Right claims its international marginality vis-a-vis liberalism and globalism, which are understood as the ideological representative of colonial modernity in international thought, is the marker of its virtue. Right? So they are the defenders, as they see it, of birth cultural sovereignty in world politics. That's their rhetorical move. That's their rhetorical pitch, which allows them to build transnational linkages. So I think this is the reason why, if I had to make a slightly kind of contentious claim, that we should think about the transnational New Right as decolonial in important ways. Because the birth cultural axiom within the New Right has an intellectual passage in common here with decolonial thought. Of course, we all know that decolonial movements weren't non-nationalist or reluctantly nationalist, right? And it's obvious that conceptions of sovereignty and nationality, like those innovated by Maurras and Barrès around culture, didn't pass unchanged through the process of decolonization. So developing a global knowledge of the international transnational New Right requires, I would suggest, a properly decolonial intellectual history of nationalism that refuses to ignore the creative impact that decolonization movements had on the intellectual history of nationalism. That is to say, in reworking ideas and practices of the nation state that are playing out in various ways in the reactionary forms of sovereignty we see playing out today. Sovereignty was reworked, of course, to challenge and combat imperial patterns of uneven and combined development and imperial racial hierarchy, right? But the proclamation, of course, of the new right, their claim to have an anti-colonial sensibility, and you see this particularly in Eastern Europe in relationship to Western Europe, right? This is kind of interesting claims around where the coloniality is, right? Suggests a much more complex conversation between East and West than is often articulated when we talk about the transnational new right. The new right is not an outgrowth of European fascism, it's a successful competitor on the right. It has successfully outcompeted fascist ideas for the same markets. So the European New Right, I think, has in some important ways stolen ideas of its critics here and repurposed them to reactionary ends, right? Because in this way, the New Right is doing almost what the right has always done, which is acting as an avatar of entrenched capital. But the transnational New Right is in important ways, I think, transnational because it's decolonial, or at least because it claims to be. And this decoloniality is a keynote in the Reactionary Internationale. The song of sovereignty sung by these movements is what allows them to tie together relationships between, people like Orbán and Bolsonaro with people like Modi and potentially Xi and so on, when they think about how international politics should be organized. So the point rhetorically is that the core conception of birth culture has a transnationalism at its heart. And that's rooted in a particular understanding of history that is in some ways explicitly anti-colonial. So it's quite an important and interesting rhetorical move that's trying to capture space in world politics. I'm going to stop there because I think I've already run over my time, but I hope that was interesting.
That's really interesting. And actually you had a couple of minutes left.
Oh, really? Okay, I can keep going if you like, but I'll stop and let some people...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you've given us a massive amount to think about there. So I'm inviting members of the audience and also members of the panel, should they wish to, just to raise their hand, or if you're in the audience, to go into the Q&A and type in your questions, please, and I'll do my best to manage and to direct them and so on. But you just mentioned towards the very end, you said the new right, the global new right, is an avatar of transnational capital. Can you just explain that?
Well, I think that I said that slightly too slickly. What I said is what I meant to say was the international right always in some forms plays a role as a defender of entrenched capital in more or less all its locations, even when it's presenting itself as its enemy. So right, one of the key moves the transnational right always makes is to read its critics and borrow their best arguments. Right? So that is the central move they make, and that's why they're so successful in my reading anyway, certainly since the 1980s. So part of that move is to do with essentially incorporating the criticism whilst cutting it off, whilst cutting off its bite. That's sort of what I meant. Does that make sense?
Sure, but I just wondered, in terms of the individuals and the groups that you look at, who are kind of represent the transnational new right, in what ways, other than, if you like, economic philosophy, perhaps, do they not also see that actually transnationalizing capital is one of the key forces behind liberalism, which is kind of globalist in character? So that isn't there a contradiction between being an avatar of transnational capitalism at the same time as being critical of liberalism, which is equally connected with transnational capital? No?
No, they are resolute critics of globalism almost everywhere. Almost everywhere you find them, they are resolute critics of globalism. In important ways, they're not always, though. I mean, America's quite a good example where you have quite a weird mixture between, on the right anyway, between kind of explicit anti-globalists of the ban-on variety, right? And this plays out across Europe as well. I mean, it's slightly more complicated elsewhere. But you have a kind of economic protectionist wing, which says that the problem with liberalism is, it's sending jobs abroad and ruin the life of the little man, right? Whilst you have another wing, which is essentially the Trump wing or the Johnson wing, right? Which is clearly tied into to precisely the same forces that produce that kind of transnational capital. So there's quite a complex relationship here. What I wasn't meaning to say is that they are an avatar of transnational capitalism in some kind of conspiratorial manner. That's not what I mean, right? I don't mean that they're like an outgrowth of capitalism. What I mean is that they defend entrenched economic interests generally wherever they are, right? In the practice of what they do, right? And I think this is one of the reasons why they borrow from their critics.
Okay, got a couple of questions in the Q&A. One from a suspiciously named individual called Niall Michelsen, so maybe a relative, asks, is this phenomenon a reaction to globalization's homogenizing effects?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is the kind of Manuel Castell's argument, right? That kind of politics of identity, that the fragmigration argument that you have globalization and at the same time the formation of local identities. Yes, I mean to some extent you have tapping into the formation of local identities, but it's not really my interest is not so much in why people are attracted to identity, right? That's not so much my set of interests. What I'm interested in is the intellectual history of particular ways of thinking about the nation fundamentally, and how that plays out in world politics, and how the sort of rules of the game are articulated around those particular ways of thinking about identity. So for me, the question is not, did globalization cause the rise of the new right? I mean, everything causes everything, right? So I mean, yes, the history that involved globalization has obviously got a relationship to it in a variety of different ways, some to do with changing economic dynamics on the ground in different countries, whether that's in developed states or sort of developing states, right? Transnational capitalism and its globalization has had different impacts in different places, but almost everywhere they've been negative for some groups, and those groups have make appeals to certain articulations of identity in relationship to it. But I think the transnational new right is interesting because it has developed a particular set of answers to the questions thrown up by, I don't really like globalization, shall we say, the post 9/11 or post financial crisis world, right? That kind of particular constellation of problems that has emerged over the last 20 years that are really convincing. Right? I mean, I don't mean I'm convinced by them. I mean that what I mean is that there are a whole load of audiences that listen to the arguments they make and find them compelling, right? And those audiences are quite diverse and move across different national communities. So I think that's more the point. Because I'm interested in strategic communication. I'm more interested in the rhetorical appeal of certain arguments and how they build relationships. I see lots more questions. Go on.
Yeah, there's a question from Sean Stars, who's a member of our department at City, who asks, can there really be a transnational right movement that's anything comparable to a communist international? The latter, of course, which was based on international working class solidarity against capitalism, whereas those who prioritize their own national sovereignty from the right want to carve out their own ethno-national state within global capitalism, that is, not overthrow it, and so on.
Well, so yeah, I mean, obviously, the reason I've used the concept of Internationale is partly to provoke, right? But look, is there a relationship? Yes, I think there is. I mean, in the way in which they talk about what they do. So there's a British example, and Tomlinson. So when Tomlinson, who's obviously a right-wing British figure. When in years to come, the generations that follow study the history of this period, there's one year that will stand out. There is one year that every school child will know, and that year is the year 2016, because in 2016, we witnessed the beginning of a global political revolution that is one that's not going to stop, and it's one that's going to roll out across the rest of the free world. Let me give you some more examples of the kinds of things I'm talking about. Here's Trump. Each of us here today is the emissary of a distinct culture, a rich history, and a people bound together by ties of memory, tradition, and the values that make our homelands like no one else on earth. That's why America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. I honor the right of every nation in this room to pursue its own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The United States will not tell you how to live or work or worship. We only ask that you honor our sovereignty in return. Right? The way in which they rhetorically position their project is as an internationalist project. That's the point, right? They don't position themselves as anti-internationalist. They position themselves as explicitly internationalist in a very kind of clear manner. They see themselves as launching a revolution in the name of birth cultures. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not an international in the sense that it's post-national, right? It's an international in the sense that it's international. It's interested in the formation of an international around national communities or national cultures. And I think that song is not parochial in the sense, they don't frame it as parochial. They frame it as something that the globe has an interest in.
But given its kind of attachment to sovereignty, I suspect that if governments of this ilk were in power in significant range and number of countries, you would see a kind of set of realist sort of international relations, but also perhaps quite aggressive given the cultural elements of their program and the fact that as a result of liberalism and global migrations and so on, you actually have mixing, right? You have minorities all around the world. And so could this not actually be not necessarily a kind of unifying, it might be a unifying moment in its inception period, but actually a kind of very aggressive, warlike, redistributive kind of movement, if it were to get into any significant positions of actual, kind of interaction and power?
I mean, I think they are in significant power in large number of places in the world. So I think in a sense we're already seeing the implications play out in climate change conferences and so on. As in, I think COP is quite a good example of the ways in which lots of these ideas are already fairly entrenched. Now, in terms of international rules and norms, I don't see them as strictly speaking realist. I think quite a lot of I mean, it's possible to read them in realist terms, and realists would say this is just the natural rules of the game. But I'm an intellectual historian. I see a very distinct idea around sovereignty at play. And the claim that what's going on is in international relations is birth cultures defending essentially their territory, right? And also expressing the rights of action they have. It has some very particular normative implications, right? So birth culture obviously subsumes human rights, right? And the idea of equality of people as well as environmental norms and so on. But transactions between states largely subsume international law. So diplomacy, multilateralism, the market are all subsumed with an idea of birth cultural sovereigns interacting. It's not exactly the same as sort of states like billiard balls interacting, because at the end of the day, as long as you respect my spheres of exclusive competence that are linked to my birth culture, right, it makes perfect sense that you would be free to do what you like elsewhere. So there's a kind of jostling implicit to here, which makes claims around who has normative rights to take action in certain spaces. This is explicitly the argument used by nationalists in this discourse. They say, well, yes, you're free to act within these spaces, but yeah, will it involve conflict? Of course it will. But it's not a Darwinian struggle for survival. The assumption is that birth cultures should be allowed to compete, because that's how, in a sense, the truth of the birth culture is expressing itself in world history. So, that doesn't necessarily imply world war, but it certainly implies a necessity of friction as the natural condition of world politics. So yeah, I think it's likely to lead to conflict in the long run, yes.
But unlike kind of realist theory, I suspect that this would be conflict which may not necessarily be driven by sort of, power as such, but by these cultural attachments which cross national boundaries, such that if you had neighboring and rival kind of cultures, if you like, but they're kind of living in each other's societies, and there is any allegations of mistreatment of minorities, etc., then you could quite clearly see a sort of very conflictive kind of politics going on.
Undoubtedly, you see exactly this discourse in Ukraine, and the Russian articulation or particular version of birth cultural nationality is central to the way in which they talk about Ukraine. They talked about Crimea and so on. There's protecting the Ruski Mir and so on, right? So there's absolutely, there's this very clear articulation within this discourse of the rights of a culture, right? The rights of membership to a culture. But at the same time, right, there's also a call for other people to be respected for it. So, there's all kinds of support for repression happening far away elsewhere in the world, right? So, you have criticism of Modi's, of Modi's rules, but from Johnson, for example, but they're quite like restrained criticisms, right? Given the citizenship laws and so on. You know, there's a kind of acceptance in new right discourse that certain kinds of things are within the sphere of competence of a state. So yeah, there's definitely a rolling back on universalism. I think.
Just have one question from the audience as well. Anna Kierkegaard from Malmo, doing peace research, says, interested in the discussion, but wonders whether the conceptualizations of right and left are really useful when discussing this new development, particularly if we want to depart from localities rather than universalist approach, or do we need new ways of thinking of this?
That's a super interesting claim. So no, I think there's a very clear intellectual history that runs back, and it is linked to conservative philosophy, right? And I think there's not a you know, these aren't ideas that emerge from nowhere. They have an intellectual history, and you need to chart that intellectual history. And you know, that's very easy to do in some places and less easy elsewhere. And then you have to chart their international linkages. It's true they don't know intellectual genealogy is entirely linear. They're not all going to the same place, right? Maybe I'm telling a slightly too simple story in charting it back essentially to a group of French nationalists. But you know, the trick, I think, is when trying to make sense of these movements is to try and work out where they share essentially intellectual resources and how they pull those together into the arguments they make in relationship both to their domestic audiences and to their international audiences. And I think that they remain right-wing movements, and I think in important ways the ideas are rooted in conservative history. So I think it retains a bit of utility still, I think.
Great, thank you, Mike. There are loads of other questions actually, which I'm sure people would ask, and I have too. But we're going to move on now to our second speaker. So Nicholas, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
For kicking us off in such a stimulating way. We'll move to the next speaker, Natasha Kaul from University of Westminster. Natasha, you have about 15 minutes.
Yes, it's 16:37 now. So, okay, remind me at in 15 minutes time. Okay, right, I want to first actually say something about the introduction. I have no idea where that was from, but just so everyone is clear, I never had any affiliations at University of Delhi, and that's not what I sent you. The relevant affiliation in this case for me would be as reader in politics and international relations at the University of Westminster, and of course previously with my previous career as an economist. So I have no idea where all that writing in newspapers, etc. But if anybody is wants to sort of refer to what my work over time, there's the most recent book is called "Can You Hear Kashmiri Women Speak," which seems rather apt in this instance, especially. And also other previous work. So that's all at my website in the CV at nitashakaul.com. Okay, so the talk today, I'm going to really be drawing upon, because 15 minutes is not a long time to be able to go through a lot of the ideas. So I will draw upon elements of previous work, which will draw from, there's a, and I'll just list those sources: Rise of the Right Wing in India, Hindutva Development Mix, Modi Myth and Dualities, about the rise of the right in India, the political project of post-colonial neoliberal nationalism, the misogyny of authoritarians in contemporary democracies, Kashmir is to India as China is to Xinjiang, and Islamophobia in India. So what I speak on will actually draw from those specific sources. Now, so I listened to the previous paper with great interest, but I have a completely different take on, on the nature of the right wing. So I do agree that they are, of course, transnational in the ways in which they, share strategies, and they have many rhetorical commonalities and the role of capital in all of this. But there are also, I think, but I would definitely, for instance, I would think that there's a worry in reifying their, the birth boundary thing reifies lots of things. In ways that, so I wouldn't say they're decolonial at all. Like that would be a big problem. I would want to not agree to that, and maybe we can discuss that later. And so instead of looking at this from the point of view of sovereignty, which, to quote Harry Hensley, creates more problems than it solves, or as many problems as it solves, in which these new right projects, by which I mean specifically the these projects that are the 21st century self-described right-wing parties or projects that are successful in multiple countries globally, that so I see them as working through the contradictions that were initially set up by liberalism between neoliberalism and nationalism in order to create hegemony. So these projects create hegemony by working through the contradictions that liberalism set up by saying neoliberalism is this thing and nationalism is this thing. One of them is economic and the other is cultural. And throughout, I will of course talk about India, but I'm also very aware of the practice that is often the case of bringing the non-West as datum. So I don't want to do that, and I want to say that when I speak about India, I'm not only speaking about India. I'm speaking about India, but the larger trajectory of my thought is to look at the new global right. So I think that these projects are actually marked by a shape-shifting strategy and many policy inconsistencies that all of them demonstrate. That they of course work on navigate the policy identity link, but there are different configurations in these countries, but there are similarities, and one key similarity is the way in which they are riven through with these contradictions, and the contradictions that they have are also So I'm arguing that these contradictions are part and parcel of how they work to create hegemony by being different things to different, to people who have actually very opposed interests. And in this sense, they are, so something like Hindutva in India, for instance, Modi's project is all things to all people. So it's capitalist to the capitalists. It's kind of pro-business. It's integral humanist to the poor. It's it's this and it's that, and it's also lots of things. So it's fundamentally, these projects are fundamentally riven with these contradictions, and these contradictions are not a problem for them. These contradictions are what they succeed through, because in kind of running these contradictions together is how they create that hegemony. I also want to emphasize that they are, however, on one aspect, they are ideologically coherent, which is how they rely upon misogyny. And I think that, and it's too much to go into right now, but there is a specific use of misogyny that these projects make in building and consolidating supporter identities, in sustaining and defending militarized approaches to policy, and in the ways in which they scavenge on progressive ideals rather than simply rejecting them. So that is something that is very systematically common to all of them. Now, and again, another thing is that, so for me, someone like Trump or Johnson cannot be understood without the prior understanding of an Erdogan or a Modi. I think that these projects, before they became as clearly visible in the global north, were actually much more visible in many countries of the global south, and Erdogan being a kind of early example. In some of the work that I quoted on in relation to Modi, I talk about how for instance, the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the kind of nationwide ideological parent, the right-wing ideological parent of the ruling BJP, that and the BJP has over time had this kind of curious way in which they've moved between an idea of economic nationalism via Swadeshi to a project like Make in India, which is on the one hand kind of pro-business, but also a lot of but also not straightforwardly so. And more recently, you would have heard Erdogan saying, the problem with the economy is actually like they're fighting an economic war of independence. So the idea here is that that neoliberalism and nationalism are not only not opposed, but that the imaginaries of nation and economy are co-constructed by these projects in order to get consent for their policy regimes, which have many contradictions. So they're constantly borrowing and shifting metaphors over, so that the surgical strike on Kashmir then becomes a surgical strike on the Black economy, inverted commas, during demonetization. So this even linguistically, this construction, this opposition, while there, is actually not there, and they're constantly moving between these domains. The problem with the neoliberal national binary, of course, is that it facilitates a very systematic understanding of local versus international, material versus symbolic, and regressive versus progressive. And I think that systematic understanding, mapping of that binary is not, it doesn't help us. And the other way in which these projects, both in the formerly colonizer as well as colonized countries, work is to mimic as well as repudiate a certain idea of the West, so that the West is understood as, at the same time as the for instance, the colonizer, but also at the same time as the entity that champions human rights. So that demands for human rights within countries of the non-West can be seen as Western projects, while at the same time wanting to also say that, oh well, we're anti-colonial, we have this legacy of anti-colonial purity because the West was the colonizer and they violated our rights. So these sorts of contradictions, they're shot through with these sorts of contradictions. And another example would be, for instance, to say that, we'll have the malls like, streets like Oxford Circus and huge malls and all of that, yet at the same time not to have Western corruption. So certain ideas of the same entity, the same sorts of entity gets used in these complex, deliberately contradictory ways in order to tell these very convincing stories that are successful for these projects. What they often result in, of course, is a huge level of banalization of violence. And in the Indian case, for example, but not just in the Indian case, I mean, the parallels even with the UK are striking. Labels such as anti-national, in the Indian case, seditious, but the wider securitization of dissent. And these take, again, different forms in these countries, but broadly speaking, it is about making, protest and dissent problematic. It is about making critical thinking and critical education problematic as being somehow anti-national or, traitorous. In the Indian case, so this is how this kind of the Hindutva project works. The Hindutva, and I also would actually say that these are very necessarily supremacist projects of either of racial supremacism, of kind of ethnic, religious supremacism, like in the Indian case, for example, quite clearly a Hindu supremacist project that this is, so that not all citizens are, of course, citizens in the same way. And, however many hundred years back, their identities go back into that boundary. Modi is seen as not just the savior of the nation. Again, a longer story, I can't go into great detail here, but Modi is seen as the savior of the nation, so much so that 2014, when he came to power, is seen as the actual time that India became independent. So people assert that India did not become independent in 1947, it became independent in 2014. The RSS, this body that I referred to before, which was founded in 1925, and then there's other important moments that happen in the history of this country, of this body. In 57, with Jansangh, then the BJP in the 1980s, and in early 1990s, the simultaneous arrival and kind of economic versus, and also this kind of the simultaneity basically of the opening up of the economy, the liberalization as it was called, as well as the rise of Hindutva. And these two things, again, so too much to go into here, but the kind of the contemporaneity of these two things have often been seen as a puzzle. And in my work, I seek to explain why actually that's not as much of a puzzle if you look at it a certain way. The dualities in the Indian case and in the Hindutva kind of version are also around how corporate versus grassroots, the idea of Bharat, which is India in Hindi, Bharat versus India, national versus international, is systematically manipulated along, on same sorts of lines. And of course, Modi as the leader is projected, as I argue, in the way of making a political myth as being ascetic, paternal, and efficient. As the champions of Hindus, but also the champion of business, supported not just by the corporates, which has of course played an important role, but also the RSS. And in all of this, in these Modi waves, the role of technology is supremely important. The diaspora, finally, I just want to sort of also say something about the global aspect of it is that these sorts of things are also being repurposed in the diaspora as, which is doing two things. It's creating a homogeneous identity of Indian as Hindu, so that all Indian diaspora are essentially somehow all Hindu diaspora, which is not correct. And secondly, the legitimization of Modi's policies. In part, there's a role also for in other work. Sorry, I forgot to mention one article on this year on on the paradoxes and entanglements of Indian diaspora in the West. So in part that is done through the sorts of politicians, through the paradoxical figures of politicians who embody cultural nationalism along with, who racialize discourse along with cultural nationalism to embody a politics of respectability. People like, Preeti Patel, the Home Secretary in the UK, previously someone like Nikki Haley in the US. So there's that sort of effect of the diaspora in kind of the way in which Hindutva works globally, and also then more specific endeavors around the use of spirituality, around the use of spectacle, and the way in which technology is used. In addition to the emotional link and the activism, including on university campuses by the youth, that works to kind of that works with the diaspora generational anxieties. So there's I don't know how am I doing for time? Do I have 4
about 3 minutes?
3 minutes, okay. Maybe I could. There is maybe one last thing I want to say and then stop, because I do want to take some questions on this. And of course, and how this works, the kind of the Hindutva as a global thing, there's partly this idea of the model minorities, Indians as the model minorities, Hindus as the model minorities in the West. So there's that, along with the global Islamophobia that plays a very important role in this repurposing of Hindutva, that Muslims are a problem everywhere, sort of a rhetoric that is very common to find amongst their supporters. And this Islamophobia in the Indian case, of course, works multidimensionally. It works to create. It works in ways that the Indian Muslim is always a suspect citizen, and the Kashmiri Muslim is a latent terrorist. The Muslim immigrant, for instance, even refugees, the Rohingya refugees, for example, are a pest, are an invasive pest, and the Muslim nation state of Pakistan is an existential other. So there are various kind of levels and relationalities with which this Islamophobia works, as and as these projects, of course, not just in India, but specifically in India also, create this these very, very violent outcomes that are about purifying identity, that are about asserting a certain very clear kind of Hindus descended from the Aryan race and therefore superior. And this sort of race thought goes very kind of deep into the RSS kind of founders, their very founders, the books written by their founders kind of have that as quite central to it. So I would not say these are, I would say these are definitely, for me, these are projects, kind of authoritarian projects that are subverting democratic principles. They are working with these various transnational linkages. They're working through the contradictions that were set up between neoliberalism and nationalism, and they quite consciously and deliberately and with intent seek to build linkages with each other. And this is, this was so, this is an avowed aspect of what they do. They want to. I think there was a document earlier this year, which revealed that in one of the ministerial meetings there was a suggestion to build links with right-wing movements in other countries. So there's a very clear understanding, and I cite that in the International Studies Review paper. So there's a very clear way in which they see what they are doing, and it's for the moment, at least in multiple countries, they're succeeding, and partly our methodological nation statism and the ways in which work within Global South and Global North gets studied separately or understood or analyzed separately is also partly, I think, at a part of the problem here, because these are, while people are often thinking within national boundaries, these are truly very, kind of critically global projects in what they seek to do. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I can see Nicholas shifting in his seat, probably wanting to ask you a lot of questions. I'd like to ask both you and Nicholas really as well, is that the way you've described Hindutva and also by extension many other new right or right-wing movements and their appeals, they're regressive and progressive. They're national as well as global. They're committed to one particular kind of culture. They mix up and contradict one another in the way in which they get their win their influence. they're different things to different people, a sort of empty signifier box which says, here I am, make me what you want me to be, and that's fine. Now, we've seen these kind of movements before, but I just wonder, what is the root reason, you would say, or set of reasons why there's such traction for what are clearly, if you look intellectually, as you do, and many of us do as well, we see the contradictions. They are glaring, they're staring you in the face. You summarize many of them. But what is it that gives it that such great appeal across such wide ranges of people in so many countries in this particular kind of last decade or so? What is it that gives that appeal almost universally at this time?
Right. So I think that to answer the second part of your question first, I think that there is a very important role of these leaders. That, for instance, were it not for these specific individuals, I don't think these projects, the role of leadership is important, and that is and many of these projects kind of coherently. I mean, for instance, in the Indian case, there's Modi, and then there's someone like Adityanath. There are specific people who have become these repositories of and kind of almost like a interchangeable with the idea of the project. So the leadership does have an important role. They also have a lot of mobilization on at grassroots level in the Indian case, again with with entities like the RSS and various kinds of other youth mobilization sorts of youth and specific wings of the Sangh Parivar, of the family of Hindu nationalist organizations, specific wings targeting different demographics. So there is that work. If you want a kind of a really kind of broad net answer to why they are successful, I think it's the decimation of education and critical thinking. I mean, I think it's the way in which in our time globally, education has come under attack, and the neoliberalization of education, the way in which kind of you study these subjects and then this is what people do with their lives. So the idea of I would bring up the link between critical thinking and totalitarianism from Arendt, and I would say there's a key part of this is the overall wider thing to do with how critical thinking is being attacked, how universities, the kinds of mobilization against critical race theory, the kinds of mobilizations against academics, and what we write and say in India against here, a Tory MP is talking about, teachers who criticize whatever should be fired. So it's actually very palpable and perceptible. The attack on education, I think, is the broader part of this story. To answer your first question, I think that it's not. They are lots of things to different people, and they shape shift, and they have a forked tongue maintenance of specific dualities. But the bit about the kind of local, regressive, international, etc. There, I was saying that these binaries are there. I wasn't saying these projects are them. I was saying that neoliberalism and nationalism are understood so that capital has a liberating effect, for instance, and the local issues are regressive, and those systematic understandings are what are manipulated by these projects as they kind of work through with simultaneously constructing ideas of what the economy is and what the nation is. And the reason I call it the post-colonial neoliberal nationalism is the post-colonial aspect there is, of course, the way in which the idea of the West is used, and imaginaries of pride and futurity are used, so that these projects promise a return to the future as the past, and whether it's Make America Great Again, and Brexit, to make Britain the way it used to be, or India the way it used to be. So all of these, regardless of what happened right now, it's about going back to that future as a past. And again, the reason I would argue that works is because we do not have a good kind of vocabulary to talk about, and this is the Kashmir India Xinjiang article, a good vocabulary to talk about colonialism that is not seen as a shame of colonizing, but as of being colonized. So the idea, I mean, again, longer thing to explain here, but the idea is there that to have been colonized is understood as a shame, and to have colonized is understood as a matter of pride. And that very problematic, systematic understanding of injury and more kind of moral shame and humiliation gets used in these projects in the way in which they give their kind of followers a sense of pride above and everything else, which is why people feel, their supporters feel so strongly about not criticizing the country abroad, because they have put up with this very systematic way in which, for instance, if there's a what's it called, the thing that goes to Mars, if there's a space launch or whatever, then there would be cartoons of this country that can't, people being underclothed or underfed. So there's a very systematic history of a racialized hierarchy that is about the colonizers and the colonized, and these projects are kind of saying, no, there is a way in which this, we can give you a sense of pride. But of course, at the same time as they're giving people that sense of pride, they are also actually not repudiating any of these economic linkages, because they are, they are at that level of sort of corporate and financial connection. There's no sovereignty really at all. So it's that pride thing that I think they really work with, and the reason they can is because the past isn't over yet, and the hierarchies of the past still persist in the present.
Thank you. We've got a question in the Q&A. This person is wondering if you can go a bit more into depth, whether you agree or disagree with what Nicholas was saying about defining the transnational right as decolonial. How do you see the Indian radical right dealing with white supremacy entrenched in the Western radical right? Right.
So I'm just looking at the questions here. So Nicholas, that's very clever of you. You've gone there. No, I'm just kidding. It's an anonymous person that has asked that question. Right. So whether I agree, no, I definitely disagree with saying that the transnational right is decolonial. One, because to me, that is a very problematic kind of use of the term decolonial, which is the existence. I mean, it's a very hard one thing to be talking about decolonial thought. And to what it means to decolonize, and to sort of give that away to a project which is essentially anything but decolonial in its ethics. I would first of all not want to do that, as sort of in intellectual terms. And I also think that it is not that these are terms with specific histories, meanings, and thoughts attached to them. Whether we use a term like post-colonial with or without a hyphen, decolonial, or anti-colonial. And these projects are not anti-colonial. They are certainly, they are in some sense post-colonial without the hyphen. They're definitely not decolonial. And, because they're not decolonial because they are ethically not decolonial. They don't actually even claim to be decolonial. They just claim to be opposing certain aspects of an other, which is really driven by that history, the history of the colonial kind of past that is rehearsed by them. And it reifies, I think, this idea of what these kind of billiard ball states and who leads them. And I don't think that it's as straightforward as that. Also, if you think about the fact that even with people from there, so Indian diaspora, if the same sorts of people in the same sorts of places outside the country can be labeled as, you are not here and you have no business talking about us because you don't live here, versus, oh my God, we are so proud of you, you are what bring us glory. But that again can vary on whether what that person's caste is, what that person's religion is, and where that which and even region in that sense. I mean, I haven't even spoken about Kashmir properly here, but there's a whole way in which that gets used, and there again, I think the birth boundary argument gets quite complicated.
Here's a question here, Natasha, about the opposition parties, candidates, and so on, like Obama paving the way for Trump. And the role of Congress, perhaps, in paving the way towards the BJP, so that is the weakness of leadership, the failure to solve the big economic and other problems. So, to what extent do you think that previous period of failure actually builds the basis upon which, or the political terrain which paves the way to Hindutva and so on?
One, I don't believe in the sort of, I mean, believe is probably the wrong word. I think I would want to stand up and argue against the sorts of equivalences that that make people say that, oh, well, it's all the same. I don't think it's all the same. It's so, for instance, Gandhi may have had 100 problems, but that doesn't mean that it's, on caste, but that doesn't mean he's the same as the guy who assassinated him. I don't think that these leaders are all the same. I don't think Obama is the same as Trump. I don't think Modi is the same as those who, I mean, from a certain point of view, people say, oh, well, every nationalist leader in India has been the same in Kashmir. Yes, but the modalities through which the ways in which they kind of carry out their plans are different. I think that I also want to give due credence, and for me, it's really interesting to analyze how these right-wing projects build their hegemony. So I don't want to say it's simply reaction to what failed before. I mean, that it's also, partly like it could be various things. I mean, it's a problem also of counterfactuals. How do we know that this is what would have resulted if they had been different? I mean, I don't think that's logically not persuasive to me to say that it's simply because the previous leaders failed. You have instances where, perfectly capable leaders lose to these projects. I mean, if I think of someone like the Hillary Trump versus Trump, I mean, Hillary Clinton versus Trump thing, I mean, at the time people started to say, well, it's because she was this and that. To me, the reason people voted for Trump is because they wanted to vote for Trump. And part of that is, of course, how Hillary Clinton was vilified, but it was also a kind of a vote for Trump. Likewise, I think in the Indian case, or even here I mean, is there any way in which, speaking just of individuals, that if you look at Boris Johnson and if you look at Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, there is no way you would think he's a kind of, more coherent, organized, efficient as a leader. So I think that these are not just about what else is on offer is bad. I think this is about, I'll go back to critical thinking, education, not understanding that, attacks on everything public are being made at the same time as the idea of the people is valorized. All of that has for me kind of this big historical echo, and that this happens because of the ways in which people are kind of tutored, inculcated into not caring, being indifferent, and not asking questions of power. So in the Indian case, I mean, yes, there was a lot of things that Congress government could have done differently. And they had that anti-corruption movement. But I think that what preceded Modi's what enabled Modi's rise to power was really the RSS and the corporates. And again, the role of the corporates was such that, so for instance, you would have these, Ambani, Adani, they have such kind of resonant names, these kind of, the billionaires backing him, that they would sort of, on their channels, on their things, on their papers, announce that there's a wave, and it would do well, and they made money out of it. So it was literally like a very symbiotic relationship between the corporates who were supporting this, him and his party, literally to the extent that I think in the last campaign was the most amount of money that was spent anywhere on any election in the world, that amount of kind of funding thing. And I think in the previous elections too, there was apparently not a single night that Modi did not return home, because he had like all of these private helicopters that were doing that for him. So it's a kind of, there's a lot of money that has gone into these projects. So to say that it was the Congress, I mean, you go anywhere, there's just like the faces. It's impossible to avoid any billboard, any newspaper, any magazine. The faces everywhere. There's massive amounts of finance that have gone into it. Not to mention in these elections, the way in which constitutional bodies have been subverted, the way in which even election commissioners have been personally kind of, there was this one commissioner who kind of who gave a dissenting opinion, and he was kind of left out of meetings. So there's a lot of manipulation of regular constitutional principles and there's an important role played by media and an important role played by money, which for me is far more important than the idea that the previous government wasn't perfect. I mean, yeah, they weren't perfect, but the ideological and the financial algorithmic ways in which these projects have these resources is kind of unrivaled, as it were.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's really interesting. Again, as always, more questions than there is time to direct to you. But thank you so much for your talk and your handling of the questions. We move now to the third speaker, Mustafa. It's all yours.
All right, many thanks Inderjeet and Juvaria for organizing this great webinar series each week. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this panel. Also, many thanks to Tanya, Elliot, and other colleagues for making this happen. So in my short presentation, I would like to focus on some of the key puzzles and paradoxes of authoritarian right-wing populism. I mean, the rise and resilience of right-wing populism, as we all know, is a global phenomenon we observe in the global north and global south. It's now a structural trend in global politics, and we currently see backsliding in established democracies, hybrid cases, and authoritarian regimes simultaneously. So all three systems have been moving in a rightward direction in the democracy authoritarian axis. So this is a structural trend. And I think a holistic perspective would be useful to explore what's really going on and why. By the way, this presentation is based on a paper I co-authored with Ziya Öniş. It's published last year in the International Spectator. So in my presentation, I will particularly make the point that right-wing populism and the ways populist leaders manage their contradictions should be understood within the context of one, economy identity nexus, and two, domestic foreign policy nexus. And this is clearly a large topic, and it's not possible for me to cover all puzzles and paradoxes in a short intervention. So I want to highlight three key issues today within that broader context. And I will refer to different countries and cases in order to substantiate my points as time allows. So the first dimension I'm going to highlight is about the political economy aspect of right-wing populist projects. I think authoritarian right-wing populist leaders are not naive about the political economy fundamentals of their projects. I mean, as the literature on populism highlights, populist leaders claim that they represent the will of the people, right, representing majority against the interest of privileged elites. I mean, they undermine opposition by portraying them as the representatives of establishment rather than ordinary people. So that's how authoritarian populist leaders communicate, right? And examples abound. I mean, Trump in the US, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, all communicate this anti-elite rhetoric in domestic and foreign policy. But even though right-wing populist leaders exploit anti-elite sentiment, their power is firmly embedded in their organic linkages to naive economic elites. I mean, naive powerful business interests. I mean, in the Turkish case, for instance, the ruling elite has been shaping state-market relations in a way that new economic elites have been the primary beneficiaries in the construction, energy, and media sectors. And of course, those business actors enjoy state support and lucrative deals in return for their political loyalty. So there's kind of a give and take relationship here, and there's a comprehensive political economy fundamental. I mean, right-wing authoritarian populist leaders use political economy instruments in order to substantiate their support base and create new economic elites. And there's an interesting trend here, actually, because as scholars of democracy point out, one of the key aspects of the current democratic backsliding is it is incremental or step-by-step nature, right? I mean, populist leaders win through ballot box, and they gradually skew the playing field in their favor. So this is what is happening in different countries. I mean, they do not abolish parliaments, but block opposition. I mean, they do not shut down courts, but pack them with cronies or control media through different instruments. And I think there's a political economy equivalent of this political process, which can be called market capture. That is, authoritarian populist leaders pick winners and losers in the economy based on their loyalty. And they can do this due to weak state capacity, institutional checks and balances. We can bring several examples from Turkey, Hungary, Brazil, or elsewhere, where authoritarian populist leaders advance particular political economy projects. I mean, although they run their campaigns on an anti-corruption platform, right-wing populist leaders often susceptible to cronyism, which is quite at odds with their original anti-elite discourse. So this is number one I would like to highlight. I mean, they are not naive about the political economy fundamentals of their projects, and they are quite keen on creating new economic elites, and they find strong supporters in different regions and countries, I will say. But we can discuss these aspects in more detail in the Q&A session. So the second dimension concerns the interface between economy and identity in populist projects. I think this also helps explaining how they sustain their performance and remain unexpectedly resilient. I mean, in some of the explanations on populism, as we all know, there's a kind of a clear-cut distinction, right, between economic grievances and cultural factors as primary determinants of authoritarian right-wing populism. I mean, several scholars rightly point out the failure of neoliberal hyper-globalization policies, increasing income inequalities, and associated economic grievances as main drivers of populist turn in global politics. I mean, on the other hand, scholars such as Engelhardt and Norris suggest that right-wing populism should be understood as a cultural backlash against post-materialist values such as multiculturalism or cosmopolitanism. Well, we suggest in the paper that a sharp division between economic and identity-based motives might sometimes be misleading, because when we look how authoritarian populist leaders operate, we see that they use a complex mixture of both dynamics. I mean, the complex mixture actually explains the rise and resilience of right-wing populist leaders in diverse national contexts. Well, I mean, populist leaders clearly care about the economy, right? I mean, they frequently highlight the failures of conventional economic paradigm. Particularly, they criticize, I mean, neoliberal project, and they clearly want high economic growth. They want to catch up with advanced countries, especially countries in the global south, and they like mega projects as national pride and prestige. Also, high and continuous economic growth matters for them because it kind of facilitates a vertical and horizontal redistribution, and it provides new opportunities for them to establish kind of cross-class coalitions. By the way, by vertical redistribution, I mean using economic resources to finance supportive business elites. And by horizontal redistribution, I mean using economic growth to finance social assistance and economic opportunities for middle and lower segments of society. But the paradox here is that most authoritarian right-wing projects fail to ensure long-term economic performance. I mean, if they remain in office for a long time, after the first term, most of the time, they kind of experience problems in terms of maintaining robust economic performance. And there is no hard data actually supporting they managed to decrease income inequality in their countries, reduced poverty, or switch to a production-based economic model, reversing financialization trend in global economy. So in terms of long-term economic development, authoritarian right-wing populist projects most of the time fail, and we've tried to show this with reference to data and some empirical evidence. However, the thing is that they still manage to survive. I mean, at least their resilience is more than expected or anticipated. And the reason is that I think they mainly rely on identity-related factors at this point in order to manage material contradictions. I mean, even if right-wing populist governments' economic performance declines significantly, in deeply polarized societies, actually, they manage to sustain their support base at least longer than expected. I mean, we can talk about the recent economic situation in Turkey in detail in order to make sense of what is going on in the country and how it translates into a political mobilization, but perhaps we can do this in the Q&A session. So that is number two. And the final point I want to share with you today is about the domestic foreign policy linkages. I think we should also take this as part of our explanation as a fundamental legitimating device for populist leaders. I mean, managing contradictions for populist leaders is not limited to economy identity nexus, I will say. I mean, if they encounter material contradictions, material problems, they switch to identity-related cleavages, but that's not the only side of the issue. I mean, the resilience of right-wing populism is also related to the populist leaders' quest for diverting public attention through an assertive foreign policy style. So foreign policy must be considered as a central feature of authoritarian right-wing populism. And of course, foreign policy scholars work on this issue extensively nowadays. So there's already an extensive literature on populist foreign policy. And there's also a political economy dimension in it. Active foreign engagement, often through the use or threat of force in regional conflicts, can also become an instrument for shifting attention from domestic problems. Basically, populist leaders put the blame on foreign powers or external enemies in order to justify domestic economic and political failures. And a typical narrative we see in Hungary, Brazil, Turkey, and other cases is that external enemies have their allies in domestic politics, which collectively constitute a security threat to the state and the nation. That's what right-wing authoritarian populist leaders communicate in their language. I mean, this kind of argument then becomes a practical instrument for right-wing populists in positioning the people, in quotation marks, against enemies, again in quotation marks. And there are several examples. For instance, Hungary's Orban used the European Union as the main target to utilize foreign policy as a domestic legitimating tool, especially when it comes to migration issue. Right? Erdogan in Turkey, for instance, communicates an anti-Western rhetoric. And the previous American president, Inderjeet, you are clearly an expert on this issue, Donald Trump, used foreign policy initiatives to maintain his popularity at home. So the point here is that, of course, people living in those countries are aware of ongoing economic or political problems. I mean, if, for instance, an economic crisis hits, of course, people are not happy about these developments. But the thing is that in crisis junctures, actually, populist leaders communicate a language that attributes blame to foreigners. I mean, the important point here is not material contradictions only. The thing is how individuals, I mean, voters interpret those developments. And populist leaders here actually switch from economy to identity, from domestic politics to foreign policy. I mean, it creates contradictions clearly, but they also come up with a kind of narrative to attribute blame or shift blame to outsiders, external actors, and their domestic co-conspirators. So again, however, active promotion of securitization in foreign policy in a quest for populist dividend, that's what we call this process, often fails to provide national security and constructive foreign policy in the medium term. But populists do not care about long-term developments in their country. I mean, they focus on current developments and they just try to steer a course out of their crisis. Also, however, that's my final point, and I'm going to stop. This does not mean that right-wing populist leaders resort to full-fledged autarky or pursue isolationist foreign policy. I mean, this issue has already been highlighted by previous speakers. In fact, they are trying to form transnational links to shape regional and global trends. I mean, this is a transnational movement in that sense, and those people are not anti-globalist from that point of view. Orban, for instance, has no intention to lead the European Union. Rather, he seeks to transform the EU from within in cooperation with other like-minded populist leaders in Europe. So they should better be called as selective globalists. They are not anti-globalists, in my view. I think it's time to wrap up. Just to summarize, I try to make the point in my presentation that authoritarian right-wing populism is a transnational phenomenon. I mean, we should look at the holistic picture. And in a shifting international order, I think right-wing populist projects should be understood within the context of an economy identity nexus and also within the context of domestic foreign policy nexus. I think I should stop here. Many thanks for your time and patience.
Great, thank you very much. It's very interesting the way in which you kind of, many of the threads and themes that Nicholas outlined and Natasha too, you've kind of picked up and concretized in a slightly different way with different cases. I guess one of the big questions which strikes me, and you kind of mentioned it in the way in which scapegoating is a key part of the technique of the right, is this idea of, in the American case, it's used as an idea to explain why poor white people have historically supported policies which have kept them where they are, as long as Black people in their neighborhoods and so on are even lower than them. And they're talking about a kind of a psychological wage of whiteness, that you don't get much economic improvement in your life but you're willing to pay the price because psychologically there is someone that you are superior to, if you like, in terms of being part of the dominant group or whatever. I get the impression that scapegoating is a very powerful factor which retains support despite the fact, as you say, economic inequality, standards of living and so on don't tend to improve very much in the long run for a lot of the voters or the people who back these Erdogan and so on. But yet they cling to that cultural identity, that sort of psychological wage of being in that dominant cultural bloc. I mean, how long do you think something like that can be sustained?
Well, that's an excellent question, Inderjeet. I think a similar process going on in Turkey right now. I mean, previous speakers also made reference to the way economic crisis is communicated by Turkish president, right? I mean, he recently declared that Turkey is actually fighting a war of economic independence. And the thing is that if you look at the last decade or so, economic policies implemented by the government in the country did not help poorer segments of society. I mean, Turkish lira is in free fall, inflation is on the rise, unemployment has always been quite high. But still, when we look at the support base of the ruling party, we see that lower segments also support Justice and Development Party a lot. And actually, this shows us that it's not only about economy. I mean, that's why actually we try to highlight this point in our paper. I mean, just putting cultural factors on the opposite side of the discussion and saying that it's either economy or culture. I don't think that, I mean, in especially certain cases, the situation does not work like that. I mean, this is actually what explains the strength of authoritarian leaders. I mean, authoritarian populist leaders. Actually, first of all, they use a plain language. I mean, they just speak through jargon-free language. They, I mean, form simple sentences and they directly speak to ordinary people. And actually they communicate, for instance, in the Turkish context, that the current government is the protector of their cultural rights, is the protector of their religious rights. If the government goes, I mean, their rights will also will be gone. So this is the kind of rhetoric communicated. And at some point, actually a trade-off emerges actually for those people. I mean, either they are gonna go for their economic interests, or either they will buy the narrative communicated by authoritarian populist leaders. And actually, what is the breaking point? What's the tipping point? I'm not sure. For instance, we will see over the next 2 years, will be really interesting to test this hypothesis because, you know, in Hungary, there is an election in 2022, and in Turkey, it's going to be in 2023, if not, it's going to be earlier. So in Brazil, we will also see what will happen. So until we see the election results, most probably it will not be easy for us to understand when people say enough is enough. Because the problem here is that, I mean, these populist leaders also operate within the context of an authoritarian environment, right? It's not easy for individuals to speak up. It's not easy to express their genuine preferences. And here I think Timur Kuran makes a very useful distinction. He says that, I mean, a political science professor from Duke University, he says that in especially authoritarian settings, individuals have public preferences and private preferences, and they do not always overlap. I mean, they know they are going to pay a high price if they speak truth to power. So they keep their genuine feelings to themselves. But if an opportunity emerges, then they just switch to their private preferences, and their private preferences turn out to be public preferences. So, I mean, we are talking about authoritarian domestic settings to a significant extent. I mean, perhaps they are not completely authoritarian states or established authoritarian states, but we are still talking about competitive authoritarian regimes. So being an opposition figure means paying a high price for what they say, what they believe, what they argue. So I don't have a clear-cut answer to this question, honestly, but clearly there is a tipping point here because people will not tolerate this trade-off indefinitely.
I just wonder, given your comparative thinking and research, as well as Nicholas's and Natasha's as well, that you are looking at kind of cross-national, but also kind of comparatively, that what do you think of the idea that the resilience of a system to authoritarian leaders and movements is partly dependent on the depth of the structures, democratic structures, or structures of the state which are not easily manipulated or used. That is what is the distinction in different systems. So I'm just thinking in terms of like last year's presidential election in the United States and the systematic attempt to basically declare the election illegitimate by Trump, try to use the courts, pressure on local election officials, in pretty much every part of the country, big section of the media echoing that kind of line. Yet there's a defeat for him, and he is, despite 6th of January, he's gone, although he's still hanging around in various ways. I just wonder, in India, for example, those deep structures probably of the courts, of parliament, and other protections, constitutional protections, perhaps are not as strong maybe as the US appeared to be at that time. And perhaps that's the same in Turkey as well. So I don't know, I'm just sort of thinking out loud. There are deep structures in different societies at different levels of strength. And I wonder if it's the variation in those which enables or disables or allows the challenges to work.
In a sense, I mean, if I may talk for the Indian case, I think in a sense, I don't know if we could generalize across the range of structures, but yes, certain kinds of things are more. So for instance, I think the media in the US case was a lot more, pushed back a lot more than in the Indian case, the media has been able to in the case of Modi. And that also depends on the extent to which the regime is able to use violence against dissenters or to kind of really punish them. And I think that, for something like, if I think about something like the farmers' protests in India and what the cost that the farmers endured, the number of lives lost, and the resilience with which they just sat there and refused to budge, and until Modi, for in this kind of very problematic spiritual talk way that he did, but he did reverse it. I think that sort of thing, I don't know. Honestly, I don't think I can imagine that happening here. Like, I don't think I can imagine that sort of political mobilization happening here. And I'm thinking back to a few years ago, this Hansard report on, the worry about the rise of authoritarianism in the UK. So I feel that if the reason I'm being like this cautious is because I don't want to generalize to say, yes, there are older established democracies which have deeper structures and which will withstand this, and those elsewhere places which can't, because I think that the human cost to people who are speaking up against this in India is enormous, and they're still doing that in ways that I can literally not imagine happening in some of the oldest democracies. And also for me, it kind of varies on which bit. So I think that the courts are variable in the Indian case. The media does much worse than the US, but there are other, but in terms of students and intellectuals and activists, most of whom now are in prison without even charges. So it's variable. I just would not want to generalize along the length of democracy and depth of structures in a way that compares states as a whole. I would say it varies depending on which bit of the structure when one is talking about what safeguards are there and how many people just assume that this sort of thing happens there. Whereas if it happens here, it would be like, oh my God, how can it happen here? So yeah.
No, but I think there are variations even within so-called more established systems as well. Nicholas, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just sort of a question and a comment, I guess. I mean, so kind of two points that come out of this I think are really interesting. The first is this point about institutions, which I'd like to make a comment on, but also the kind of point about whether they make whether they actually succeed economically. Actually, Sean Stiles has actually sort of slightly stolen my thunder by asking the same question in the Q&A, but I'm going to ask a slightly different version of it, which is that, I mean, actually to the same point basically in both spaces. Is there that deep trust in democracy, even in its home, anymore? I mean, like realistically, I mean, isn't this the problem? Isn't the problem fundamentally that in all the places that are supposed to have these incredibly deep institutions, there's an absolutely massive number of people who A, don't vote, and B, think that the entire political establishment is literally built to rob them. And they have like a fair amount of evidence to support this because they've got poorer and poorer over the last sort of 20 odd years. So I wonder if asking the question about the depth of institutions, or asking the question about how much do they really improve the living standards, is slightly, I think maybe if we look at it in a slightly different way and say, the source of the transnational far right is a fundamental loss of faith in the model of liberal democracy. It's quite deep and it's quite substantive, and it's based on a whole variety of things. It's based on militarism, it's based on failed economic promises, it's based on failed democratic promises. So I guess my question, to frame this as a question for Mustafa, and I thought your talk was super interesting, so thank you, the way in which you answer it is that basically they hide the economic failures with cultural arguments. I wonder if the way in which they would respond, I'm not obviously one of their supporters, is that the problem is that the economic strategies being framed outside the cultural argument have failed, right? So their argument is precisely that only the turn to culture is the solution to the economic problems. So, as in for them, the story is inverted. It's not one or the other. It's via here to get to there. Does that make sense to you in terms of the Turkish context? But maybe it doesn't. I'd just be interested in hearing your reflections, Mustafa.
Okay, Mustafa, you have the last word in your segment.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Nicholas. I think it makes sense. Yeah, that's what is going on in the country to a significant extent. And another important point related to our discussion, actually, is about the institutional capacity. That's why actually in my presentation, I raised the issue of state capacity or institutional capacity. In the United States, for instance, Donald Trump could not win elections, right, last year, but in 2020. But if he managed to win elections, and what would the American democracy look like over the next 5 or 6 years or so? And the point is that if authoritarian populist leaders have the opportunity to remain in power long enough, they change institutions, they subvert institutions in a way that they skew the playing field in their favor, and it becomes extremely difficult for opposition forces to make their voices heard. Because, as said, they are not, from a political economy point, they are not naive. They create their new economic elite, they create actually a strong support base, and all these people actually know that they win because they support existing government. So it's not something going on with reference to market dynamics. It is all based on their political loyalty and the usual perks and privileges they get in return. So in the Turkish context, part of the explanation, I think, concerns the longevity of the current government. They have been ruling the country since 2002. It means almost 2 decades. Now they have the opportunity to control different state institutions, to control civil society. As a result, actually, a kind of democratic comeback has become more difficult. But on the other hand, it also shows the resilience of opposition in the country. There's still a vibrant opposition. Opposition parties are quite robust, especially given the fact that they are operating in a restrictive institutional environment. Civil society, I think, is still vibrant as much as it can be. So I think the Turkish case is interesting because on the one hand, it shows the resilience of authoritarian populist projects, but it also implies how fragile they are. That's why actually it's really difficult to make predictions and whether they will be able to manage their contradictions as they used to be able to do in the previous decade or so. So probably that's how I see the situation.
Great, thank you so much. There's so many interesting variations and kind of confusions and threads which cross. It is a fascinating area. But thank you, Mustafa. That's really interesting. We move on now to Xin, who is our final speaker. I remember when we had something about the transnational right a few weeks or months ago, Xin was in touch with me on Twitter saying, why didn't we also talk about China? And I said, on that occasion, we didn't, but we might at some other point. And guess what? We have someone, we have Xin at this, so he can tell us a little bit more about the situation in China as well. So over to you, Xin.
Thanks a lot. This conversation has become so fascinating that I got a little bit carried away. So in that case, before I do my regular presentation, I would like to offer 3 short comments. One is recently we had a workshop on temporality and crisis. If we look at the rise of global right as a crisis, then the question we ask is, what's the temporality of it? Is that an ongoing conversation, ongoing crisis, or that is something deeply structured and embedded in the global system? So in that sense, right, this is the reason that I'm doing this presentation, and I'm starting a new research project. That is, as a historian, I'm quite reluctant to talk about contemporary issues because that is not my expertise. Rather, in this project, I'm looking into the historical origins of this rise of the complex feelings towards liberalism, and maybe related to the rise of authoritarianism in China. So in other words, I'm using a historical approach to tackle a contemporary problem. And also, I have to be honest that this is a research project that I just got started. It's a book project. I have two chapters, draft chapters written, but this is a book-long project. So some ideas here are immature, but I would really love to hear comments and feedbacks from audience and scholars here. Let me get started. Today, a lot of people are talking about the rise of China. The rise of China may change the world. The rise of China may give us another Cold War. As people talk about the issue with fear and trepidation, right? So people are feared about China. And people in China are also looking at the world with lots of anxiety and uncertainty. When it comes to China, a very basic question still needs to be answered. That is, what is China? Is China a nation, state, empire, or civilization? If it were a nation, then who were the Chinese people, or who are the Chinese people? The Han people? If a state, is Taiwan part of that? And how about China's relationship with Tibet and Hong Kong? And is there any real unchanged core, right, of Chinese civilization running through historical time and global space? So far, the studies on the China question follow three general approaches. First, scholars inside the country often follow an indigenous intellectual tradition and examine key aspects related to the formation of China as a modern concept, tracing their historical origins. They tend to treat China as a continuous historical entity evolving over the long durée of historical time. In other words, they believe that there's something holding China together, be it culture, ideology, or national spirit. Second, an increasing number of professional scholars and political activists outside the country adopted an analytical approach that questioned the very essence of China as a continuous civilization in history and its integrity as a unitary political entity in politics. To name just one example, in a recent book, The Invention of China, Bill Hayton documents how the modern notion of China was invented as a homogeneous political entity by a small group of intellectuals in the face of historical reality. In works that follow this approach, the contention is not whether or not China is imagined, but rather how China is imagined. Third, a group of scholars, primarily historians working outside of China, have shifted away from the attempts to construct mass narratives on what China means and adopted a frontier history approach to investigating how the Middle Kingdom's involvement and the interaction with its bordering neighbors. These scholars place the formation and the transformation of the Chinese state within the context of Inner Asian, East Asian, and Southeast Asian connections and the entanglements. In other words, these scholars study China by focusing on how China historically evolved through its interactions with its neighbors. In this project, I will neither offer another perspective on what China is, nor attempt to study another border region, for there is already enough research on both. Rather, I would like to introduce a historicist approach to investigating the power relationship that shape the process of receiving and rejecting certain discourses about China. Two examples. One look at, the first example looks at contemporary debates. In focusing on Chinese intellectuals, Gloria Davis has already engaged the China question in such a way. In worrying about China, she critically examined the debates among contemporary intellectuals on how to achieve national perfection. She points out that these intellectuals often assume a sense of moral responsibility while discussing China. The other looks at global context. For example, Fabio Lanza investigates what China meant to the left activists in the West in the 1960s and 70s in the context of global Maoism. Maoist China became a viable interaction to global capitalism. I appreciate both approaches, but I see the China question not as a contemporary problem, but one deeply rooted in this country's troubling relationship with the modernizing world. In other words, in my project, I'll try to further historicize the China question and uncover the stream of emotional politics that run behind it. The theme for this panel is the transnational right in world politics. And the title for my book project is The Right to Talk About China. Here, I have to clarify my position on the using of the term right. This right is not that right. On this term, three premises have to be established. First, in the transnational context, the right I refer here in the title of my book is not a right of legality. It is a right of self-perception. No international treaties, at least from my channel knowledge, have regulated on how people outside of China to talk about China. Therefore, Chinese cannot do anything legally against those non-Chinese who contradict their self-perceived right on how to talk about this country. Second, it is a right of imagination. Some Chinese scholars believe Chinese culture is appealing and foreigners have not yet fully understood it. They imagine that one day foreigners could potentially come around and convert to that culture. Third, one party's very action against this self-perceived right often provokes emotion responses from the other party. Using the China question example, in the months leading to 2008 Beijing Olympic Games, the term national humiliation appeared 88 times in China Daily, the CCP's flagship leadership newspaper. In a similar tone, 19th centuries countries and organizations had heard the feelings of the Chinese people. Today, China's political discourses is tainted with emotional feelings: shame, glory, frustration, humiliation, and anger are the buzzwords that Beijing often refers to while discussing to the world. In this sense, if the right to talk about China is not a right of legality, it is a right of emotions. Based on these observations, I contend in my project that we cannot arrive at a consensus on the China question, not because we do not know enough about the subject matter. Rather, the challenge is the question has become so emotionally charged that a rational conversation about it has become seemingly impossible. Behind it, it is the acting of a type of emotional politics that rejects anyone that does not fit into certain stereotypes, the right to talk about the country. In the China field, there has been already some very good research on emotional politics, especially the history of it, such as Eugenia Lin's study on the rise of public sympathy in Republic period, Li Chen's chapter on how imperial powers perceive China's legal system through sentiments, and Christopher Reed's work on humor, and etc. In dialogue with these works, my project will investigate how anger, frustration, and passion affected people's view on the China question. And how do I do my research about the emotions? I'm an intellectual historian. And in my research, I try to place human agency at the center. In this book, I select some leading Chinese intellectuals based on 3 criteria. They were influential, they were non-partisan, and they had made sincere efforts to talk about China in their works. In study with them, with appreciation of contingency in history, I choose 5 moments in the 20th century when these individuals were engaging discussions on the China question. By both zooming in, looking into these moments, and zooming out, contextualizing these moments, I have identified several factors that contributed to the rise of emotional politics among Chinese intellectuals of the 20th century. First is about identity. I start with a well-known liberal intellectual, a would-be leader in Chinese politics, Jiang Tingfu in the 1910s. When he studied in the United States, he resented the way in which American missionaries talked about China. He knew what they talked about was probably right, but he just felt uncomfortable when foreigners talking about China negatively. Second is about gender. I looked into a controversy in the 1930s. A feminist writer, Chen Hengzhe, wrote about her family's journey to Sichuan, but she was pushed back by the public sentiments from that region. So much so, her husband had to resign from his position, and the family had to leave Sichuan because she has a province in China. The third is about the scholarly expertise. I examined the scholarly tensions between traditional ways of studying China through theories in the 1940s. We can see how some scholars became so opinionated with different scholarly approaches. They look down upon those scholars who they consider as outsiders. Fourth is about cultural devotion. Examining a scholarly debate on new methods to study Qing history, which is the last dynasty in China, I present a case where some scholars rejected and even became infuriated with their colleagues' efforts to deconstruct Chinese history. And the last one is about one's position with the mainstream views of the time. And here I use the example of Lin Yutang, who was widely regarded as a spokesman of China in America before 1942. Yet he suddenly lost the media's favor and fell into silence as his view on China became against the mainstream view in the United States. These individuals came from various intellectual and political backgrounds, but they all share the same concern with China's position in the world. The external pressure of Western imperialism and the internal struggle of gender and academic politics induced their emotional views on who had the right to talk about China. Here is my hypothesis. Who has the right to talk about China? This is not just a question about intellectual perspective, but also social positioning. And this social positioning is a byproduct of the resistance to and the backlash of the imbalanced knowledge production and the cultural exchange within Chinese society, as well as in the wider world. The exchange with the outside world, as scholars have long pointed out, is often accompanied by the introduction, adoption, circulation, and appropriation of nationalism, colonialism, imperialism, between and among empires, nation states, and would-be nations. Therefore, being beyond national history, I consider this project a study of social production of China-related knowledge in the context of China's interaction and the entanglement with the modernizing world of the 20th century. This project is significant beyond the discipline of history. While examining Chinese state's international behavior, foreign observers often point to the vulnerability of Chinese national psychology, stating that Chinese nationalism can be oftentimes emotional and sometimes irrational. Yet they fail to notice one critical source of tension, that is, as China in dialogue with the world, the spokesmen and women from China and their foreign counterparts often have divergent views on who has the right to talk about country, even before agreeing upon what China is. Thus, the project will be an intervention into the current study of international relations based on vigorous research on primary sources in Chinese intellectual history. It speaks to the growing interest in the China question among public intellectuals and the policymakers. One last point. In this way, the project also encourages researchers to rethink the unintended consequences caused by the iron rule of the rationality regime that grew out of the European Enlightenment tradition. While a significant portion of society is constantly neglected, marginalized, and dismissed by the knowledge regime of rationality, what would happen to their repressed feelings? What has happened to the Brexit in the UK and the Trumpism in the United States offers us a gleam of possibilities. To acknowledge this point, this project will not be one-sided critique of the irrational nationalism that has already been well documented in academic discourses in China today, for it also recognizes that Eurocentric bias and Orientalist tendencies have contributed to the current discussion of the China question in the West. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. That is so interesting and so rich. And I must admit, it's very difficult to know where to start with the question. So I'm hoping someone in the Q&A will be able to. And Sean Stars has saved the day. One of my colleagues at City, he says, would you say that Xi's emotional politics has similarities with Trump's rhetoric that the world is laughing at us, that we don't win anymore, and things like MAGA versus the making the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation? Both talk about humiliation and overcoming it, the politics of victimhood that seems to play well domestically, but is totally ineffective overseas at changing opinions and foreign policies.
This is a really interesting question. And again, I'm not a political scientist, so I try to avoid contemporary affairs. But let me just say a few words on this issue. A couple of years ago, we had a workshop on theorizing anti-colonialism. So basically, scholars from different fields in history together, we look at the rise of anti-colonialism and also related to anti-colonial nationalism. And someone in the audience made a very good comment. That is, he said, well, it seems that someone's anti-colonialism is someone's colonialism. I think this point makes really a powerful, I guess, impact on me. That is, when we're looking at the global circulation of knowledge, it's really difficult to find the origin. You know, it's not about who inventing what, rather it's about the spectacle, right, of the circulation of analogies, comparisons, and feelings, emotions in the international politics. So here, it's really interesting to observe that Trump picks up some emotional aspect of politics, perhaps from other parts of the world. I'm not sure there's a genealogy between Trump and Xi in terms of this very idea. But one example I could use is, you know, in China, there's a famous saying by the time of the founding of the People's Republic. Chairman Mao announced the Chinese people has stood up, right? This is the very signature saying that he used in 1949 at the time of the founding of the People's Republic of China. But a couple of years ago, Australian Prime Minister used the same words, right? Saying now the Australian people has stood up to the Chinese. And so in that case, I guess the global interaction, right, or global, I guess the rise of China changed the balance of this global conversation and creates this sort of entanglement of using and sometimes abusing certain historical analogies and historical references. So that is my way to respond to the question. I'm not sure if I fully I'm able to fully answer the question, but that's my perspective as a historian. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Natasha, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Xin, for that talk. I actually wanted to ask you, it's really interesting. I wanted to, well, also say exactly about, this commonality of words between the slogans used by Modi supporters in 2014 and by Trump supporters in 2016, eerily similar. Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar is what Trump said, which was Ab ki baar Modi Sarkar, this time Trump government or a Modi government. Okay, my question to you is, so that very kind of nice, wonderful way in which you phrased that, and you said it's a study of the social production of China-related knowledge in connection with, can you just complete the rest of that sentence so I can ask my question correctly? In connection with China's interaction with, what was the thing that followed it?
With the international, with the global interaction and the global entanglement.
Yes. So there, my question to you is, do you find, I mean, as a project, it's just so fascinating. And do you find that there is a difference based on what, until now, in how that was with splitting the global into the imperialist from the Chinese point of view and the rest of the world, the regional countries and the others, which were not seen in the way that the West was? Are there any differences in that, systematic differences in the study of that social production of knowledge where China is relating with specific countries that it sees as its kind of other, as opposed to other countries that are not seen in the same way?
Oh, this is a great question. And this question has been always on my mind. That is, when I was a graduate student, I read a lot of post-colonial literature, and I love it, right? I think the first book I wrote about world history and the national identity in China, I was heavily influenced by post-colonial theories, but I did not cite anything. It seems that there is a strong opinion among China scholars that is post-colonialism does not apply to China because China is never a fully colonized country. But at the same time, I do feel that when we are dealing with the issue in China, we're not just looking at the issues in China alone on its own. Really, we're looking at a way that we can use a local case to speak of some global concerns. So to be specific about this issue, when we're looking, for example, when we're looking at Xi Jinping's view on the world and Modi's view on the world, and perhaps Trump's view on the world, one way of doing that is we follow the traditional historiography, right? To seek for a lineage, to reconstruct a teleology, right, from one point to another. But I think I feel most beneficial from post-colonial literature that is, it's time for us to rethink this teleology. It's not about who is influencing who. Rather, it is the structural issue we face in this global culture. So the other day I had a meeting with, I had a chat with a friend who works in World Bank. And he talks about that he's managing some projects to help education in third world countries or the countries in the South, global South. And he basically, what he does is he works with the local agency, right, to reform the school curriculum and to offer low interest loan to these schools in the global South. And then I asked him, how about the United States? How about the Rust Belt in the United States? For example, I'm teaching in Western New York. We are in trouble, and the trouble we're facing is deeply, it's so. In other words, we can actually apply some ideas from post-colonial studies to understanding issues in the United States as well as in China. So I guess probably I belong to the global theory part. I think we use local references and we look into the complex feelings in the local, but fundamentally, all of us are trying to tell a global story. Hopefully this makes sense to you.
So yes, absolutely. I mean, I've spent the best part of last several years, if not the decade, kind of trying to argue precisely why post-colonialism is relevant in countries that are not colonized. And also that the legacy, neither human rights nor the ability to colonize is actually exclusively the reserve of any part of the world. If we look at India's actions in Kashmir, as I said, I mean, it's no different than a standard kind of colonial move. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that, as you said, there's the, there's all of these. Colonial history didn't just happen elsewhere, neither, it happened everywhere. So yes, I completely understand that. I was, I don't know if it still makes sense, but the question that I was asking was more kind of about history, like in the way in which knowledge about China was made by people at the time then. Was there a difference then in perception? That's sort of, I don't know if that's making sense, but that's what I wanted to, I don't interrupt you. I was like, you're preaching to the converted. That's so essentially, I mean, when I argue about something like the way in which the moral wound of colonialism gets used, and how this is, how post-colonial international relations is actually everyone's international relations and not just elsewhere. I completely agree with all of what you said. But my question is more specific to kind of in that past that you're talking about. Because not contemporary era, and how did that was that systematicity still evident? Were there any striking ways in which that came out in your research?
Absolutely. Thanks for the
Can I just Nicholas wants to come in with a question, and okay, so you have the last word. Thank you, Nicholas, because we are running a little bit over our time. So Xin, would you like to address Natasha's last question?
Absolutely. I love this question, and I guess I'll start with the local. In my book, the first book on world history and national identity in China, I look at some intellectuals in China. And when they were, so these intellectuals were educated not inside China, but in the West. They were educated in the United States, in Europe, and other places in the world. And when they were studying about China in other parts of the world, they felt a strong sense that they're being controlled. They're in a very unlucky position in the global circulation of historiography. In other words, they realize that the history of China is not written in China, right? It's written outside of China. And especially in the process of writing, the Chinese scholarship or Chinese national feeling, right? Sometimes it's being consulted, but oftentimes not. So, but this actually is related to what I'm doing now, right? So when we are thinking about so-called our own history, this is probably also related to Nicholas' research, right? This is sort of a nativist view on history. Sometimes you have this feeling that my history is being written by other people and these people don't understand us. And maybe there's a gender, right, behind the way in which they are writing about us. What should we do? Can we do anything? And in this case, right, in terms of Chinese historiography, they cannot do much, right? The people inside China, they're writing in Chinese, and they're writing in a way that has been rarely translated to the outside world, right? So they cannot do much. And if they cannot do much, where's the outlet of their feeling? And I'll use one example here. I'm not sure this is proper. Remember Edward Said, throw a stone, right? Throw a stone at the guardhouse. What is the emotion that drove him to have that action? And how that action is being understood, right, in the West and in his native land. So I guess that's the place where I should start my conversation. But I really appreciate your question. I think this gives me a lot to think. Thanks a lot, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Xin and Nicholas and Natasha and Mustafa. Incredibly rich discussion, and I would have liked to ask a lot more kind of contemporary political questions to Xin about the way in which emotion, nationalism, and the feeling of kind of humiliation and so on is actually politically mobilized within China and in its current politics as well. and what that might portend going forward. But we run out of time as usual, actually. But I really want to thank you, everyone, for your contributions and your patience with everything, and for making the time to speak with all of us. And I thank the audience also for their patience and perseverance as well on a Friday evening. And oh, actually, it's probably Friday afternoon for Xian as well. But thank you so much, everyone. Next week is the sixth one of the 6 webinars. We've got a panel of 4 speakers who are going to talk about how do we do global knowledge? How do we create global knowledge, global ideas, and have global conversations which are meaningful and take us further forward? So it's a kind of discussion about what this whole series and the other preceding series are really trying to do and about, and problematizing this idea of global knowledge. Can we even do it? What does it look like when we are doing it? And so on. So I think it should be a really interesting discussion to round off this particular series. So see you hopefully next week at 4 p.m. But for now, thanks very much, everyone. And yeah, see you again very soon.
Thank you very
much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.